In this video, you will learn about a method of instruction called an ideas tug of war. Students study multiple documents and images to collect evidence that will help to answer a central question. In this video, we will look at this strategy in the context of our study of European exploration, and we will gather evidence to answer the question, was Christopher Columbus a hero or a villain? Keep in mind that this instructional method could be used to study any of the explorers or another topic of study entirely. This unit of study seamlessly integrates social studies standards with reading standards. Specifically, this unit addresses History Standard 2, which focuses on European exploration in North America, as well as Geography Standard 3B, which asks students to describe how early explorers adapted or failed to adapt to the various physical environments in which they traveled. Additionally, this unit asks students to apply several social studies information processing skills, including comparing similarities and differences, distinguishing between fact and opinion, identifying main idea, detail, sequence of events, and cause and effect in a social studies context, identifying and using primary and secondary sources, interpreting timelines, charts, and tables, and drawing conclusions and making generalizations. This unit also asks students to practice with a variety of skills discussed in the informational reading standards, particularly the key ideas and details standards and the integration of knowledge and ideas standards. If you haven't done so already, you may wish to watch the instructional video in this series focused on reading and analyzing social studies texts with third graders, and the video about using images to better understand history. This study focuses on the central question, was Columbus a hero or a villain? It's a great idea to begin by having students list everything they already know about Columbus. No need to allot a great deal of time for this because most third graders' knowledge of Columbus is limited to discovering America, perhaps 1492, and maybe the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. Explain to students that they will be learning a lot about Columbus using information from a variety of sources, including Columbus himself and people who knew him. Sometimes this information will make Columbus look like a hero, and sometimes it will make him look like a villain. Their job will be to collect as much information as possible to make a fair judgment about whether hero or villain is a better word to describe Columbus. Now it's time for students to set up their ideas tug of war evidence sheets. In the center of the sheet will be the question, and to the left, students will note evidence showing Columbus to be a hero, and to the right will be evidence showing Columbus to be a villain. You can create a simple organizer for students like the one shown, or you may choose to give students a long strip of paper, like a sentence strip or cash register tape, to act as a holding place for sticky notes containing evidence. The benefit of having students collect and organize their information on sticky notes is that they allow students to rearrange the evidence by how significant it is when the end of the unit comes and they have to draw a final conclusion. Explain to students that we call this an ideas tug of war because sometimes they will encounter information that pulls them toward one side, and other times they will encounter information that pulls them toward the other side. That is why whenever we have a big question to answer, we have to gather information from multiple sources to be sure we are seeing all the sides of an issue. Historians do the same thing. Big questions are rarely easy to answer. Now is a good time to review the difference between primary and secondary sources. For third graders, identifying primary versus secondary sources is a developing skill that should be mastered by the end of fourth grade. As a reminder, primary sources were created during the time period being studied or provide information from people who experienced events themselves, even if the documents were created later. During this study, students will examine primary sources such as journal entries and letters written by Columbus. Secondary sources were created long after the time period being studied. Often the creators of these documents, whether they're books, internet articles, or even paintings, use primary sources to gather information. During this study, students will examine secondary sources such as social studies textbooks, biographies, and artwork. Now that students understand the task and have reviewed the differences between primary and secondary sources, it is time to jump in. Many students believe that a social studies textbook provides them with everything they need to know about a topic, so reading about Columbus in your social studies book is a great place to start. Students will quickly realize that their textbook provides only a brief overview of Columbus, and that it takes multiple sources to develop deep understanding. If your school does not use a social studies textbook, a brief biography of Columbus will do the trick. With a quick Google search, you can find numerous biographies of Columbus written for kids. Just be careful that you are using a reliable source. As students read their textbook or the short biography, they are likely to hear lots of facts, including names, dates, and locations. But they may not hear much that helps them to answer the central question, was Columbus a hero or a villain? This is an excellent opportunity to help students understand that sometimes information they encounter is outside of the question they have been asked. This relates to Informational Reading Standard 1, which requires students to answer questions to demonstrate understanding of a text, referring explicitly to the text as the basis for the answers. It's okay if students don't find any information to support the side of hero versus villain in this first reading. Students have not only been introduced to or reviewed basic information about Columbus, but they have also learned that not all sources are created equally when trying to find the answer to a question. Now is a great time to move on to using an image to learn more about Columbus. An image search for Christopher Columbus will result in a seemingly endless number of portraits, but those won't add a great deal of evidence to answer our big question. Paintings like Columbus Taking Possession, published by Prang Educational Company in 1893, or Landing of Columbus by Vanderlyn, or The Return of Christopher Columbus by Delacroix, offer far more insight into the relationship between Columbus and the natives and the reception he received upon his return to Spain. It is important to consider your audience when selecting which image or images to use, since the native people are often depicted in the nude. When examining a painting, there are many techniques you may choose to use, including those described in the instructional video in this series, focused on using images to better understand history. The key is giving students a tool to examine the painting in detail, perhaps using a quadrant analysis in which students focus on a single segment of the image to develop a more detailed sense of what the artist was attempting to portray. As students observe the paintings, they will likely find evidence that supports the idea that Columbus is either a hero or a villain. For instance, when examining this painting, Columbus Taking Possession, students may note that the native people are hiding in the leaves. This may provide evidence that the native people were not happy to have Columbus explore their islands. This piece of information would be added to the organizer on the villain side. Or students may analyze this image, The Return of Columbus, and suggest that Columbus was a hero because he brought back many items to Spain, which was a primary goal of his voyage. This piece of information would be added to the hero side of the organizer. It is important to remember that students can collect multiple pieces of evidence from a single image or document. This is also an excellent time to discuss the reliability of information. When analyzing these paintings, students were working with secondary sources since the works were created long after Columbus's time. Therefore, they are viewing artists' interpretations of events, not candid photographs that would provide a more objective view. Now that students have examined secondary source texts and images, it is time to dive into some primary sources. A simple internet search will yield long lists of primary sources relating to Christopher Columbus. We will look at an excerpt from a letter and from his journal in this video, but you could certainly find far more than this. Of course, primary source documents like these are not easy reading for students. They were written by adults, for adults, in a time long ago, and the language is reflective of that. For that reason, these short excerpts require close, repeated readings for students to make sense of them. I hope you will also view the instructional video in this series that focuses on reading social studies texts, including primary sources, to learn more about how to make primary sources accessible to third graders. Let's take a look at an excerpt from a letter written by Columbus to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. This is a small excerpt from a much longer letter. From these few sentences, students can learn a bit more about Columbus through his own words without being overwhelmed by a longer text. Take a moment to pause the video and read this excerpt to yourself. One of the first questions students will have to answer is, to whom is Columbus referring when he uses the words they and them? There is no direct reference in this excerpt from the letter, but students may be able to infer that he is referring to the native people of the island. Introducing this fact prior to reading can make the text far more accessible. Questions such as, how does Columbus seem to feel about the native people? And, according to this journal, how did Columbus require his men to treat the natives? Can direct students to the key points of the journal while also giving them practice with Informational Reading Standard 1. After reading, students should add new information to their Ideas Tug of War chart. Based on the information gathered from this letter excerpt, students are likely to add evidence to the hero side of their charts, such as Columbus wouldn't let his men just give the native people their garbage when trading. But they may find other evidence as well. After reading this letter, it may interest students to read a brief excerpt from one of Columbus's earlier journal entries. This entry paints a very different picture of Columbus and his interactions with the native people. This document may be particularly tricky to young readers due to vocabulary and sentence composition. If you choose to use this document, you may consider offering a more student-friendly translation of the document like the one shown. If you make this choice, it is important to share the actual language of the journal with students before providing the translation. Take a moment to pause this video and read the actual text from Columbus's journal as well as the student-friendly translation. Reading this journal entry certainly shows a different side of Columbus's interactions with the native people than what students saw from the letter. Using the information from this journal entry, students should add new evidence to their Ideas Tug of War charts. This may also spark an interesting class discussion about why Columbus would seem to feel one way about the native people in his letter to Ferdinand and Isabella, and another way in his journal. You may continue gathering information from additional sources or limit your information gathering to the collection of primary and secondary sources suggested here. Once students have sufficient evidence to support their opinions, they should write a brief opinion piece responding to the question, do you believe Columbus was a hero or a villain? A task that supports third grade writing standard 1. Students should introduce their opinion and then provide reasons based on their research to support that opinion. While it is likely that you will only include a handful of sources in this unit, remember that some of your students will be eager to learn more. Providing access to other informational books in your classroom will allow these students to explore the topic in greater depth and gather additional information. A list of highly readable informational books about Columbus is included at the end of this video. Once you have completed this unit, you may wish to read a fictional account of Columbus's landing. A particularly useful book for this purpose is Encounter by Jane Yolen, which tells the story of Columbus's arrival on San Salvador from the point of view of a native child on the island. Students can compare this fictional account to the sources they studied previously and consider how point of view affects the way a story is told. Remember, the unit described in this video is only a sample of how you may choose to use the Ideas Tug of War strategy in your classroom. Units like this engage students in the study of history and expand their critical thinking skills in ways that benefit them throughout their schooling and in life.